Good morning. I'm in a little bit better mood this morning because that $1,400 government check was plopped into my bank account. On top of my Social Security, I can live 3 or 4 months off of that. So, I can't be starved out for another 3 or 4 months. I've gotten a little more progress made on the dirt on Dickens, and I'm going to share that in a minute. We're seeking the original sources, the primary sources, as much as I can possibly get to them. But before I do that, I've got a couple other things I want to touch on. And I do notice that the entries about the dirt on Dickens get more hits than the other ones. So I'm figuring out how this works. You know, I've definitely the dirt on Dickens is coming. We've just got a little bit else that I want to talk about. Um, so, first of all, yesterday I presented Matthew Franklin Whittier's early social reform novel, The Debtor's Prison, A Tale of a Revolutionary Soldier. And of course, I'm trying to absolutely nail down the fact that Matthew was the author of that book and not Asa Green, as the historians have assumed. I can prove it, but there's long proof and short proof, and people want short proof. You know, long proof is cumulative evidence, which is plenty good in a court of law, but people want it on a silver platter, in other words. They want a signed document where Asa Green admits on his deathbed, that he wasn't, but he didn't steal that stuff. It was Matthew keeping undercover that caused, Asa Green was helping him out and publishing for him, and Matthew kept his name off the thing. It's Matthew's fault as far as that goes. On this case, I think Asa Green was an honorable man, and I do not think that everybody whose name ended up on Matthew's work was a scoundrel. I want to make that clear. I think Asa Green was a good guy. It's just that he was busy running his bookstore and Matthew ran his newspaper for him. That's all. And when Matthew wrote these books, when the cholera epidemic hit New York City and they had to close it down, Matthew left, he wrote some books, 5 books. And Asa Green, initially at least, helped him publish these books. And so Asa Green's name is on there in at least one case here as a publisher and as the person who registered the book. And then in other cases, not. In this case, I'm blanking on the name of the book, with The Debtor's Prison, there's kind of a strange anomaly going on. Now, I have written at the Library of Congress to try to get to the bottom of this. Was this normal? Was this abnormal? What's going on? But what's going on is that in 1834, when this book first came out, I've got my notes here, we have, and that edition is available through the Hathi Trust, originally apparently photographed by Google because Google's watermark is on there. And it's 1834, published by A. Green, number 1 Beekman Street. Now, I don't know, but I'm guessing that that's where Green lived, probably on top of his bookstore. I would have to trace that down if it's possible to trace it down, which it may not be. And it's registered by Green. So where it has the little page, which I'll put up on the screen of the registration, that's by Asa Green. This is why some historian just conveniently assumed that Green must have been the author, and it all went from there, see? So Green's been credited with everything in the Constellation that was Matthew's and these 5 books, when it's obviously not his work. Then the copy that I have, the physical antiquarian volume that I own, does not have Asa Green's name on it, and it was published the following year in 1835 by Bliss, Wadsworth and Company, and it was registered by Bliss, Wadsworth and Company. Now, I don't know if we can nail down, if this is proof, but it's suggestive and it's consistent with Matthew being the author, because the first year Asa Green helped him get it published. The second year he published it again with somebody else on his own. See? So maybe a larger run, maybe a little fancier, cover or something. I don't know. But it's not so much consistent with Asa Green, saying, well, I'll publish it myself the first year. But then the second year, I'll use a different publisher aside from myself, and I won't put my name on it the second year. See, that doesn't make sense. So this scenario is consistent with a hidden author who publishes it himself the second year and keeps his name off the registration and just has the publisher. See, I don't know. Let's see what the Library of Congress says, because I've written a query. That's the first thing. The second thing is, before we get to the dirt on Dickens, is that I've decided one way to get people to see my photographs is to intersperse them in here. See, I even thought that I might just stick them in arbitrarily, but that's a little bit gamey. I'm going to show you a couple photographs and maybe a little clip of video from a place called Two Lights Park here in Maine. It's in Cape Elizabeth near Portland. This is just down a little bit. You've probably seen the Portland headlight. Anytime that Portland, Maine ever comes up, the icon, the iconic image is the Portland headlight, which is actually in Cape Elizabeth and not in Portland. I had a past life memory hit, a very strong one, at the Portland headlight, which I've talked about in my sequel. But certainly, Two Lights Park felt very familiar. And what you have here is the rocky coast of Maine, which is kind of interesting because when I was a little boy, and I don't know how far back we're going, but I'm thinking very far, because as far back as I can remember, I wanted to see the rocky coast of Maine, and I had no idea what that was. I don't think I'd ever seen a picture of it that I know of. I'd never seen anything on TV. This goes before I ever probably went to a movie, I'm talking 3 or 4 years old. I longed to see the rocky coast of Maine. And what's going on here, I think, is that when I was really little, I had a memory of Matthew's life. And then at about age 2.5, my parents moved from Southampton, Long Island, New York, to Miami, Florida. And that seems like a cutoff where suddenly my memory was stopped. And from that point on, I was desperately trying to remember something, and I couldn't remember what it was I was trying to remember, but there was something deeply significant that I was trying to remember. And one of the things that I desperately wanted to remember was about the rocky coast of Maine. It was like I'd hung on to that one thing, see? So this is, in fact, the rocky coast of Maine. And I've told you that I have, in the past, in this life, had a very strong interest in photography, that Matthew Franklin Whittier also had a very strong interest in photography. So here's a couple 3 shots that I took at Two Lights State Park of the rocky coast of Maine. So this is the one I really like the best. I've just arbitrarily labeled it Rock Waves. I've gone in and done a little bit of contrast adjustments, and I've cropped it. I think the cropping really is part of what's going on here. But it really does look kind of like a wave, doesn't it? It's interesting that the same forces in water also act on rock, but just a little more slowly, see? Let's see here. And here's another one. This is angle and cropping, because I had this exact same subject at a different angle, and it just really didn't work that well. When I was doing black and white printing, I learned the hard way that if you have an image that almost works but doesn't quite work, you can spend half a day trying to print it. And in the end, you'll put it up on the wall, and after 2 or 3 days, you'll take it down and say, it just doesn't quite do it, So I learned out of self-defense, which ones work and which ones don't. Now, of course, I don't have to spend so much time with them, but the other angles didn't work. It was what Ansel Adams used to call scenery quality, snapshot. This is a photograph. And it's the lines of force and the contrast and the fact that you have living moss or lichen and the rock and the crystal and the granite or whatever it is. And this looks like it really is volcanic and has undergone quite a bit of stress. Again, I'm not a geologist, but I do know that Matthew was fascinated by rock and patterns in rock and quartz, because there's a big rock right at the entrance to the Whittier farmhouse. And when I got there, I had a past life hit, not about the things you'd expect, but about the vein of quartz that runs through that rock. I said, I know this. I used to be fascinated by this when I was a kid, see? Those are the kind of things that come to you. Nothing that you can prove. This is the problem with trying to prove past life memory. You don't get those kind of memories. So anyway, and I think there's one other one. Yeah, there's one other one that shows you what the coast actually looks like. And I shot, I don't know, 25 or 30 shots of this coast trying to get one that was artistically pleasing. And this one I like. So there's something about the way the wave crashes up. But to give you a better idea of what it's really like out there, I'm going to show you a piece of video. All right, so that's enough of that. Now, I wrote to the British Library, and I got a very nice, very prompt reply. You get a good reference librarian, and they don't care. I don't think she knew I'm into reincarnation, but they don't care what you're into. They will do their job, and you get a good one. So they're really helpful. So I got this dissertation, and along with other references, but what I was looking for was this business about Dickens performing, giving readings. This is after Matthew saw him in New York. This is toward the end of his life in 1868. And he's including in his readings this scene of Bill Sikes murdering his girlfriend, Nancy. And he really got into it, and he got into it so much it gave him a stroke on stage. But then, and this is what I'm trying to track down, apparently he was observed or caught or seen performing this privately in the garden after the doctor had ordered him not to perform it publicly, which is to say it was doing something for him. Now, in this dissertation, which is called Secret Agonies, Hidden Wolves, Leper Sins, The Personal Pains and Prostitutes of Dickens, Trollope, and Gaskell, a dissertation, I don't mean to be mocking, but it really amuses me, a dissertation by Claire Eileen Carley Miles, submitted to the Office of Graduate Studies of Texas A&M University, of course it's Texas, just kidding, in partial fulfillment of the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, May 2008. And as you might have guessed, she gives a deep psychoanalytic type interpretation of why Dickens was doing this. I can't remember. I think she goes into like an Oedipal complex and, all kinds of awful business of digging deep into Dickens' psyche as to why he was doing this. I think he was doing this because that was pretty much who he was, and he was getting off on it, and being an actor was an excuse for getting off on it. What it does tell us is that he was essentially a sensationalist. This is the point I've been trying to make, that he could not possibly have written A Christmas Carol because he simply wasn't that deep and he wasn't that spiritual and he hadn't really studied genuine metaphysics. There are genuine metaphysics in A Christmas Carol, and beyond that, it's a genuinely inspired work, like the photography I've been showing you and many other things. He couldn't have written it. So, you don't have to go too much further into this thing. It's like, it's like the little kid that has the wallet, with like $300 in it. And, you can look into the wallet and you can see that that's not his picture. And you can, do more investigation and find out whether, he has a bank account and whether he could have $300 and where he could have earned the $300 or, that kind of thing, and look for fingerprints. But you don't need to go into all that stuff because a little kid doesn't own a wallet with $300 in it. This is what I've been trying to tell people. It's all unnecessary. Dickens could not possibly have written this work, A Christmas Carol, any more than the little kid could own the adult's wallet with $300 in it. But anyway, I'm going to read to you from this dissertation, and then she gives sources, which are books, biographies And I have those biographies on order. I don't have access to a library here during COVID, and libraries are a nuisance anyway. So what I've done is just bought them cheap, like $5, $4 from thrift books or on eBay or whatever. And they're on order. These books should be coming in. I've got four biographies of Dickens coming in. One is The Mystery of Charles Dickens that I talked about by A.N. Wilson. Another, which the librarian says is probably the most authoritative, is Dickens, a Biography by Fred Kaplan. And the third is Dickens, A Life by Norman Ian Mackenzie, whom this dissertation writer quotes quite a bit. And then there's another one called Dickens and the Daughter of the House by Hilary M. Shore. That's a Cambridge Studies in 19th Century Literature and Culture, series number 25 is what that comes from. So all four of those are currently winging their way to my house through the post office. And I will get back on here and give you their references, because hopefully they refer to primary sources with luck. Here, Ms. Carly Miles says, in his autobiographical fragment, Dickens wrote about the blacking factory experience. Let's see, I don't need that, I don't think. Here we go. In 1863, Dickens resumed his examination of shame. See, she talks about shame. She thinks he does all this because of shame. And the shame apparently came from having to work in a blacking house for a little while. Well, I worked as a landscaper, for crying out loud. One job I had was for like several days, all I did was cut every other bush in a huge field, with a saw. I wasn't scarred for life by doing that kind of work. I don't know. Anyway, forgive me. That was editorial comment. In 1863, Dickens resumed his examination of shame and his identification of himself with Nancy. I don't know where, I haven't read the whole dissertation, so I don't know how she gets that. By returning to her murder. Apparently he's murdering himself as Nancy, which is pretty darn kinky. Academia is wonderful. 36 years after he wrote Oliver Twist, he began to shape the murder scene into a reading for his public tours. And this is quoted Kaplan for page 444. We will look it up. Its importance to him was evident in a letter that he wrote on 24th of May, 1863, and we will get to the bottom of exactly who he wrote that to and so on. I have been trying, alone by myself, the Oliver Twist murder, but have got something so horrible out of it that I am afraid to try it in public. And this is quoted in Mackenzie, page 373, which we will also have in-house. Perhaps the quote, something so horrible, was not only the horror of the murder itself and his worries about its being too terrible for his audience to endure, but what it represented for Dickens in his own mythology, the murder of himself. Well, everybody has to have an angle in a dissertation, Something he was not quite prepared to enact in 1863 as he set the reading aside in favor of other selections. I want to mention that if I can get the letter, a lot of times the quotes that they pull out are not necessarily the most important ones, certainly not for what I'm trying to do. So that's why I'm trying to get these letters that prove that Dickens tried to have his wife Catherine put away in an insane asylum, because there could be other references that have to do with A Christmas Carol. Catherine Dickens could have said things about Charles Dickens, quote unquote, writing A Christmas Carol. So we shall see if that comes in. Still waiting for it. 5 years later, however, he was ready, making the reading a part of his farewell tour from October 1868 to May 1869, and which was extended into 1870 because of ill health caused by the strain of the readings, especially the murder of Nancy. And this is in Kaplan's book, page 532. He's also coming in. In the fall of 1868, then, about a year and a half before his death, Dickens began to relive Nancy's murder on the stage in public. He was still attempting to suppress his shame and escape from his fallen past. Okay, I'm going to try to keep the sarcastic comments. This is Matthew coming through so intuitively, you might have noticed. Clearly, he had reached no resolution with regard to his shame, so he felt compelled to revisit it and recreate it. With every asshole that did something criminal or otherwise, could use his shame to, to excuse himself. The prisons would be empty. um, and this is, make no mistake, this is a white collar criminal we're talking about. Clearly, he had reached no resolution with regard to his shame, and so he felt compelled to revisit it and recreate it. He performed the scene of her murder obsessively, with no regard for the toll that the reading was eventually to take on his health. According to Kaplan, Dickens, though worried that the reading of Nancy's murder, in brackets, might prove too upsetting, even revolting to his audiences, loved the experience of being absorbed in it, of acting it out, of being both murdered and murderer. And people think that this is the author of A Christmas Carol. If they do, they don't understand that A Christmas Carol is not simply a work of imagination that's nice. The scheme and its satisfactions became like a drug to Dickens. The pain of the rigorous performance was nothing to the pleasure he derived from it. Kaplan writes that Dickens, quote, went on murdering Nancy with a regularity that became addictive, and when Dickens was finally forced to cease the readings for a time because of severe lameness, quote, the enforced withdrawal was even more painful than his swollen foot, page 533. When it was suggested that the performance was too strenuous and should be omitted, quote, Dickens was angered, smashing a plate, and shouting at Dolby, his agent, for his, quote, infernal caution. That's in Mackenzie 377. Before his last performance of Nancy's murder on 8 March 1870, Dickens himself stated that, quote, I shall tear myself to pieces, implying that, divided between Nancy and Bill, he recognized that the consequences of that division would be his death, as it finally was. Now here's somebody, Ackroyd, and I haven't ordered his. As Laurie Landbauer observes, I don't know who she is, Dickens', quote, obsessive murdering of Nancy, in brackets, was self-murder. He enacted the scene against the advice of doctors who told him the excitement on top of his ill health was suicide, as indeed it was. Hilary Shore gives the further details. We do have her book coming in, recounting. And this is the crucial part that we want. When he performed the reading, his pulse rate rose from 72 to 124. And where does she get this? This is what I want to know. After reading it, he would collapse on a sofa, unable to speak. Wilkie Collins, among others, believed this reading, quote, did more to kill him than all his works put together. His physician forbade him to continue it. And yet, here we go, a friend reports that a day or two before his death, he was discovered in the grounds around Gad's Hill, performing the death of Nancy. Now, this is in Hilary Shore's book on page 30 to 31. I am hoping she has a reference because that's the one I want. Now, I want to briefly touch on this issue of, the complexity of human beings and the shadow, and can good people or even spiritual people or even inspired people go down dark alleys, dark places. And yes, they can at times. There are portions of Matthew's work that are violent and crass, well, especially in Ethan Spike. And this has been remarked upon by some of his, one or two of his, only like one or two biographers, by one of his biographers in particular. And there's a couple elements to this. First of all, Ethan Spike was a satire. He was racist, he was ignorant, he was cruel at times, he was self-justifying, and Matthew was writing a caricature. So the caricature is not him. Other parts of Ethan Spike were autobiographical, so that character is a very strange mix of himself, including his shadow, and a caricature of people that he was trying to lampoon by way of exposing the ignorance of mankind, really. So it's a slippery slope trying to determine this. But the other side of that was that I felt very strongly, intuitively, and I can find quite a bit of evidence suggesting this, that his second wife, Jane Vaughan, when they separated, It was an arranged marriage he never should have gotten into. His mother apparently arranged it. Sight unseen, he married this woman. I will talk more about her when I go to her gravesite, which is coming up when we get the weather's a little milder out here. She was from St. John, Canada, and she would take the children up there. And he would go up there to visit the children, and she would, by hook or crook, manage to prevent him from seeing his own children. It was a custody visitation situation. And it would absolutely infuriate him. So much so, I think, toward the end, that he would drink. He had a drinking problem early on, and he became a temperance man, a teetotaler, and wrote eloquently against the evils of alcohol abuse. But towards the end of his life, a couple things happened. He got stuck in a dead-end job. He remarried a third time on a practical basis, and the woman was, it's not clear what Mary Waite Tolman really was, but I think she was rather a shell. She was practical in the Machiavellian sense, not in the sense that Matthew would mean practical. He developed kind of a stoic, practical philosophy of life toward the end of his life, but it wasn't this Machiavellian practicality, that was just without principle, I think. And I think that's what Mary Waite Tolman was. And so Matthew, at some level, knew that he was in a very bad marriage that was kind of fine on the surface. She was kind of like a companion with privileges, more than a marriage. And then between being stuck in this dead-end job and the fact that his best work had been publicly claimed by all these other people, and nobody had any idea what his true literary contribution was, and he was fast becoming a has-been, in terms of Ethan Spike. Because early on, before there were strong copyright laws, excerpts from Ethan Spike, not the strongest excerpts, but excerpts from Ethan Spike would be printed all over the country. They would go into the Portland Transcript, and then they'd be printed all over the country, and he had a certain amount of grassroots fame. But during the Civil War, he stopped for a while. I think he was under threat. He stopped, and then he picked it back up again around 1868, 1869. But by that time, there were copyright laws, I think at least by 1870, that prohibited editors from copying anybody's work without probably paying them. And so they just simply stopped copying them. And therefore, except for Portland, Maine, nobody knew that Ethan Spike was still running, at all. So by the time Matthew died, in his obituaries, they were saying that he was, a former humorist from the middle of the century. See, they didn't even know that he'd picked back up again. So he was a has-been. So all of that was extremely depressing to him because he was, full of life. I do know that he wrote a children's novel in 1863. There may be other works. But the other thing is, I feel that he fell in with author Bret Harte, and that Harte got him drinking again. Can't prove that. That's all kind of an area that's still open to be proved or disproved. But I'm pretty strongly sure from past life memory that he fell in with Bret Harte, and Bret Harte got him drinking, being a bad influence. Matthew was subject to peer pressure and bad influences. That's what his children's novel was about in 1863, that exact topic for boys. Matthew did have a drinking problem later in life. And interestingly, in the biographies of Matthew, what you see is that he was a drinker. He drank heavily as a young man, and then he drank heavily as an old man. And this long period in the middle when he was a strong advocate for temperance and a teetotaler is never mentioned. This is how they have trashed Matthew's legacy. And this is what makes it interesting, because right from the beginning, I remembered these things that did not fit with his biographers and his biographies. See, um, so I am trying to track down specifically what this reference is. And the reason is not that good people and people of integrity and spiritual people don't have a dark side, because everybody does have a shadow side and it can come out. But what I see with Dickens is that, again, that what we take for his more spiritual side or his lighter side is mostly an act. That this guy was an actor and a hypocrite, and he really was not a spiritual person. He couldn't have written an inspired work like A Christmas Carol. And again, this is obvious, but if we can establish that he returned to privately performing this thing after he was told by his doctor not to do it and after he stopped doing it on stage, what we have is proof that he indulged in it because he wanted to, because he was getting some pleasure out of it, because it did something for him. Now, as far as the interpretation, I don't buy this psychoanalytical shame interpretation. I don't know what kind of shame we're talking about here. But in order to kill yourself, you have to have some pretty serious shame going on. But that's not all we have on him. What we have is a whole lifetime of publishing sordid details about the lower classes, which titillated the Victorian imagination and sold a whole heck of a lot of books that made him famous. What we have is a sensationalist, in other words, and not a moral reformer, and not a spiritual author, and certainly not anybody who could have written the spiritually inspired work that's in A Christmas Carol, and certainly not anybody who would have written something deeply metaphysical and deeply spiritual in A Christmas Carol, and then scratched it out and put something religiously inane, which I can prove that he did, and that's in my article. So, I mean, I have him. You know, I mean, this is proof positive. I've got the smoking gun, you know. The problem is getting anybody to take it seriously. Well, we shall see, you know, whether extremely intelligent people can come out of denial and admit the obvious. That's what we want to see. When I get into Hilary Shore's Dickens and the Daughter of the House, and I find that one quote that she gives, we shall see if she gives an original primary source for that. And then I'll see if I can obtain that, possibly from the British Library or somebody else, you know, see if I can find it. And if I can find it, I'll see if I can provide a photographic image of it. You know, I can't get any further than that because I can't physically get my hands on it and show it to you in front of the camera. But we're going to get right down to the primary source on this one. I think that's all I have for today, and I hope you enjoyed my photographs. We will have more dirt on Dickens within probably take a week or two for all these books to come in. One more thing that I wanted to mention, and that is that assuming she got her doctorate, Dr. Carly Miles is getting her doctorate in English. And I have a master's in counseling and human systems from Florida State. Now, it's kind of interesting. I have been sending people emails from a list of colleges which ranks them. And if I remember correctly, Florida State is number 60 in the country. So it's, you know, pretty highly ranked. I have better credentials to talk about the psychology of Charles Dickens than this woman does. She may have better credentials to talk about literature, but I have better credentials to talk about psychology. So I haven't read the whole dissertation. I'm not sure what the shame is. My impression is that she thinks it's from this early period where her father was thrown into debtor's prison and he had to work in a blacking factory for a year or so, and that somehow or other this has so scarred him with shame that he has to murder himself in the fictional character of Nancy. Now, I may have missed a couple steps. I think I have missed a couple steps in there as to what exactly his, maybe it's Oedipal shame, you know, that he had a thing for his mother. Supposedly he hated her, according to Wilson. I'm not sure what she's got going here. What I think she has going here is what I said earlier, and that is that increasingly, this was 2008, so this is pretty early, but they're finding this dirt on Dickens, and they're finding that he was not an exemplary character. And yet he wrote what seems to be elevating literature, what people take to be elevating literature, including A Christmas Carol. How is that possible? Well, it's only possible if you assume that this spiritual philanthropist had this some kind of tortured inner existence, and it would have to be shame or something. So far as I know, nobody comes up with my obvious conclusion that he was a hypocrite, that he was never what people assumed him to be, that he assumed that as a role that he was acting because he was an actor. So they stand on their heads to come up with some other explanation that leaves him a sincere man of integrity, see? And I don't think he was. So we shall see. This is kind of the way that people who believe in philosophical materialism have to stand on their heads to explain something that is relatively easily explained if God is in the picture, see? If mystical truths of God and the manifestation of the known world from God is taken into account, as above, so below. If you have as above, so below, you don't have to turn yourself into a pretzel to explain things. So similarly, they're trying to retain this idea of the Dickens with integrity, and they're standing on their heads to come up with some explanation. Well, again, I have better academic credentials to assess this particular issue than she does and that these other English professors do. So that's all. More dirt on Dickens later.